In my first year in the seminary, I think it was maybe my first semester, a group of us were asked to help run a confirmation retreat at one of the parishes in London. And at one point in the retreat, myself and another seminarian found ourselves leading sort of like a small group discussion. And one of the kids at the table asked us one of those simple but very deep questions. He just said, "Who is Jesus?" And trying to impress people with the 10 weeks of seminary behind me, I tried to come up with some eloquent answer, but just kind of ended up rambling for a few minutes, and I'm pretty sure I did nothing more than confuse the kid, because he cut me off and looked to the other seminarian and said, "What do you think?" And the other guy just said, "Jesus is God." And I thought, oh, that's way too simple of an answer. He'll never buy that. And the kid said, "Oh, that's cool. Jesus is God. That's great." This question of the Lord's identity, who is Jesus, comes up today in our gospel as he begins his public ministry at Capernaum and preaches in the synagogue. And the crowds are astounded because he teaches as one having authority and has power to cast out even the unclean spirits. And though they're amazed at this power and the authority that Jesus has, none of them, not even those first disciples who he called last week in the gospel, seem to recognize that he is Lord. It's only the man with the unclean spirit who recognizes who Jesus really is as he cries out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." Throughout Mark's gospel, despite having a front row seat of the power and the authority that Jesus has in his preaching and in his miracles, the disciples will continually struggle to believe, to have faith that Jesus is the Messiah. But the demons and the spirits and the unclean spirits will recognize him as the Holy One of God, as we hear in our gospel today. And that always seems strange to me. It seems strange to me that these people who see what others have longed to see, who have heard what others long to hear, who left everything to follow him, struggle to know who he is. But the demons and unclean spirits know exactly who Jesus is. I think for us today, I don't think we have a problem grasping that Jesus is God. I think we know that, at least intellectually. I think where we might have a problem, though, is recognizing his power and authority and accepting that power and authority over our lives. When times are good, maybe we've answered the Lord's call to start a new job, or maybe we've fallen in love with somebody, or we've entered the seminary. Whatever it is, the excitement, the fulfillment, the satisfaction of knowing we're doing God's will feels great. And maybe it's not even we've started something new. Maybe things are just going really well in our lives. And I think even though we know that God has blessed us with the goodness that surrounds us, I think we can fail to appreciate just how much God is involved in those moments. I think we can miss how much God does. We know that, he's looking out for us. He's blessing us, but I don't think we quite understand how much he's involved. And because of that, it can kind of give us an illusion that we are way more in control of our lives than we really are. And so when the challenging or disappointing or confusing moments of life come, or when we're thrown into a challenge like this pandemic, where something has affected literally every aspect of our lives, instead of recognizing the power and authority that God has in our lives, instead of recognizing that Jesus is Lord of our lives, we try to do our own will instead of God's. And that's where we fall into trouble. Just like the demons and the unclean spirits fully recognize who Jesus is in the gospel today, It seems to be when we're confused or we're disappointed or we're angry that we really see God working in our lives. But we see it as imposing. We can see it as restrictive. We can see it like he's trying to control every aspect of our lives. After a stressful day where all we want to do is just go to bed, even though we haven't prayed, that voice reminding us we probably need to pray can be very annoying, and we can just want it to go away. When we're angry with someone and we want to pick up the phone and kind of tear a strip off of them, that voice in our head that reminds us, well, maybe we should pray for forgiveness rather than lash out, can be very frustrating. When we feel annoyed or frustrated or imposed by what God's will is, forgiveness, prayer, it means we've hardened our hearts. And like we hear about in the psalm today. And it's easy to fall into because it's so tempting and so easy to try and do things our way, to try and do our will instead of God's. It's hard to follow God's will in difficult moments, especially when it seems confusing, or God's will seems like it's more than we can handle, or seems like it's going to take way longer than our way. And the psalm doesn't really give us a lot of help in how to avoid this. It just says, if today you hear God's voice, don't harden your hearts. That's not very, just saying don't do it's not very helpful. But I think if we look at the verses of the psalm, we realize that, hail the rock who saves us. That's what Jesus came to do. And we have to remember what he came to do, that he came not to impose himself on us, not to control our lives, not to make us feel bad about ourselves every time we follow him imperfectly, but he came because he loves us. And while it's tempting to harden our hearts at the voice of the Lord, to harden our hearts when the Lord asks us to be faithful amidst great difficulty, we must remember that the Lord came so that he could heal us from our wounds, forgive us of our sins, and redeem us to make us his own for all eternity. He comes to be Lord of our lives, not to make our lives more difficult, not with force or power or coercion, but to offer us his love, his healing, and his salvation. In the difficult moments in following him, when we want to harden our hearts, we can look to the cross, because on the cross we see human sinfulness on full display. We see frustration, we see disappointment, confusion, we see pain, we see agony, we see basically everything that weighs us down. We see everything that prevents us from coming closer to Jesus. And on the cross, we see that he has experienced the same things that we experience, the same disappointments, the same pain, the same frustration. And so it is a reminder to us that he understands our pain, that he understands our sinfulness, that he understands our frustrations and our disappointments. And so he has not entered our lives to make them more difficult, to impose himself on us, but rather to offer healing, to offer forgiveness, and to offer peace. Though the cross is a place of agony, a place of sinfulness, it is also, in the very same place, our redemption and our salvation. The mystery of the cross is that the place of agony and sin at the same time became the very means of our salvation. The cross is a good remedy against hardening our hearts because it reminds us that no matter how difficult doing God's will may seem, it will always lead us to peace and to joy. This peace and joy isn't because everything is going to be wonderful all the time and the Christian life is always going to be really easy, but because we realize in allowing ourselves to be transformed by the Lord each day, by letting Jesus be Lord of our lives, we will come ever closer to him, which will lead us to holiness, which will lead us to salvation. It is in following the Lord each day, despite the challenges that come with being his disciples, in recognizing him, in remaining faithful and not hardening our hearts, we allow Jesus to be Lord of all things, including our lives. In a world that is frantic, that is often filled with uncertainty and with confusion, it's comforting to know that Jesus is Lord of all things, including us. While the rest of the world seems to be searching for answers, seems to be searching for meaning in all sorts of places, we need not ask, to whom shall we go? Because we know the answer is Jesus. Because he indeed is the Holy One of God, who has come not to destroy us, but to bring us his kingdom of joy, of love, and of peace.